again, so hello from Abu Dhabi. As Elena, I hope, told you, my name is Ricard. And when I was asked to do this session, I was thinking to myself, trying to recall the Montevideo Convention of 1933, and also think back to the time before 9/11 of who had actually recognized the previous Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And I wasn't entirely sure who had done so, but I obviously, with my fantastic Google skills, I managed to find out that it was Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and my new home country, the UAE. And when it comes to international law, so I'm going to take a more academic, pedagogical spin to it, even though I don't have any PowerPoint slides at the moment. But thinking back to international law and whether you should recognize states and how recognition is achieved, we have to turn to what I mentioned, the Montevideo Convention of 1933, which outlines the general criteria for creating a state. And these include a permanent population and a defined territory, although boundary disputes do not necessarily prevent an entity from being considered a state. Another element of statehood is, of course, an effective government. And this factor is not as absolute as it sounds, however. So the United Nations and many other countries have recognized certain entities as states, even while, for example, civil wars rage within their actual borders. But finally, a state must also be able to conduct international relations. I should mention a caveat. There will be a lot of howevers in my talk here now. I will not necessarily try to play the devil's advocate, but I will try and put it in terms and explain why we do certain things and whether we should do things. And then there will be the caveat of the however. So, however, statehood doesn't rely on recognition, but sometimes a state may have a duty to refrain from recognizing another state or an alteration to a state. And this situation usually arises when the state or altered state arose from illegitimate military actions, violations of human rights, for example, or other clear infringements of international norms. So the United Nations Security Council, they often set an example for states on this issue. For example, it nullified the annexation of Kuwait by Iraq during the period preceding the Gulf War of 1991. And in other cases, a state may not recognize an entity that meets the baseline criteria for statehood until it actually meets specific additional requirements. So, for example, states formed during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they didn't receive recognition from what was then the European Union, so the European Community, until they had committed to certain concessions or treaties, etc. In this case, until they committed nuclear non-proliferation, minority rights, and also respect for borders. So this is the normal way of achieving recognition, right? Namely, making concessions. In its current state, however, see, another however, is something that the Biden administration is yet to do, for example. Instead, the Biden administration has yet to rule out recognizing the Taliban. The administration is said to taking stock of the situation, while calling on the Taliban to protect the Afghan people's rights. And this, of course, is a reversal from the administration's previous promise to actually oppose the Taliban if they took power at the point of a gun, which we all know they did. Arguably, the world should then refuse recognition until the Taliban proves over many years that it's part of this so-called civilized world. There's precedent for holding back in this case, because, for example, it took even 30 years for the United States to recognize communist China. So prior to this, in 1949, the formation of the People's Republic of China, they were obviously granted a permanent seat on the Security Council, but until the 70s, that was obviously held by what is today Taiwan. It also took the US 20 years to recognize communist Vietnam. And in other cases, such as Pol Pot's Cambodia, they never obviously received recognition. So given what we know and what's happening at the moment, the Taliban should be treated no differently. And a spokesman for the European Union said that the Taliban will be judged on their actions, how they respect international commitments made by the country, how they respect basic rules of democracy and the rule of law. So the biggest red line here is respect for human rights and the rights of women, especially. So the United States, for example, they've said that the Taliban will be judged on whether they allow freedom of travel for Afghans and foreigners with the whole valid documents, women's and minority rights, and probably more important for Washington, whether the Taliban prevent international terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base, as they did in the past, and which is why we're in this predicament that we are. Diplomatic recognition, however, would help open direct channels for development aid and also sizable loans from countries and institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The Afghan economy is of course dependent on foreign aid and spending with cash running out, because as we know, and as Bakr was touching upon, Afghanistan has been plagued with rampant corruption, and billions of dollars have gone to enrich national and local political leaders and many other layers of society. So in order to answer one of Ken's questions in who has actually benefited, well, unfortunately, too many have benefited from the situation in Afghanistan. Obviously, arms dealers, the drug traffickers, and many of them obviously would be the former political leadership of Afghanistan. And I didn't hear the ground rules that were set in the beginning, but if this is Chatham House rules, then I would be able to say that much of the money that has been stolen from Afghanistan is based just an hour drive from here in Dubai, where many of the political leadership, and same thing, but there's a lot of Taliban money around as well. Obviously, Ashraf Ghani, the former president, I should say, is staying in Dubai at the moment. And this is, of course, a huge problem for Afghanistan, and why we have seen the prolonged situation. Other obviously complications would be Iraq, and engaging in two wars at the same time complicated. But I'm sure we will return to this during the Q&A session. But given Afghanistan's need for imports of food, of medicine, and also energy, and with fears of widespread hunger and disease, the West hopes that the Taliban will be more receptive towards demands for moderation. Whether I believe that will be the case, I simply know. There is absolutely nothing telling us that the Taliban, exactly what Bakr was touching upon, is that they have not changed. They have no intention of changing. They are very savvy. They know exactly what to say, and their media apparatus is very efficient. The propaganda machine of the Taliban is, I was going to say second to none. But it is very efficient in terms of the message that they are putting out there. And also we have to separate the leadership, the Taliban negotiating in Qatar from the actual leadership in the country. So Again, we might actually be faced with forcing ourselves to recognize the Taliban in order to avoid, for example, another refugee crisis like that of 2015. But for now, the United States, European Union, and my other home country, Britain, have suspended their considerable aid programs. And Afghanistan's central bank reserves, nearly all of them held abroad, have been frozen. So the IMF has also withheld over $400 million that was obviously scheduled to be delivered to the old government this month, but that's clearly not happening. The US and allied officials, they also say that they want to continue providing humanitarian, no matter what political system emerges in Afghanistan. And most of the aid could be channeled through the United Nations agencies or through a possible new trust fund from the World Bank. So countries would not give directly to the Taliban, which is clearly what has happened in the past. And out of those 7 trillions, a lot have just gone lost, right? They disappeared somehow, magically appeared elsewhere. But the most powerful leverage that the United States and the rest of the world have against the Taliban are still terrorism sanctions, which prohibits contributions of money, goods, and also services. So some of those sanctions have been, of course, complicated or have complicated the aid efforts, even by charitable groups that actually try to keep their political neutrality and simply aid those in need. And given the Taliban's history of human rights abuses and reliance on illicit finance, sanctions are likely to remain in place for now and for the foreseeable future. So if we think about countries that potentially could recognize the Taliban government, we have, apologies if the aircon is interrupting my speaking. I'm in a very hot country and it goes on automatically. We heard Bakr also mention Russia and China cozying up to the Taliban and so on. But as of yesterday, the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they have agreed not to recognize the Taliban government in Afghanistan until they receive assurances that it will actually comply with the prescripts of international law. That being said, countries and states, they make all sorts of promises, right? We don't necessarily need to trust that the Russians and the Chinese will actually follow their own recognition threats and promises. So we will simply wait and see. When it comes to the United Nations overall, the once, say, unthinkable prospect of a Taliban envoy representing Afghanistan at the UN, which of course is naturally is the most powerful symbol of international legitimacy, right? So now it actually appears one step closer, because there are still obviously big hurdles remaining, because an official application has yet to be submitted. And when it's submitted, it must undergo review by a rotating 9-member group of countries that currently includes the United States. So that is probably not going to happen anytime soon. But for now, the toppled Afghan government UN ambassador holds the seat still. So, and as I said, I keep a close eye on the embassy outside my office window. So we will see whether things will change. But diplomats, however, they say that any Taliban request for a seat would, of course, be rather premature. And the world community is not a place yet where we're actually prepared to recognize the Taliban. Hence, in short, should we recognize the Taliban government? My answer is no. However, time will tell, because as often as we hear it, we will not negotiate with terrorists, we will not talk to them. We obviously are lying to ourselves, because we have, and we always will. That being said, the world is of course not static. It's continuously evolving, and therefore we might see a legitimate recognized Taliban in the future. But in the immediate future, it is highly unlikely, and it will probably take many years before it's fully recognized, of course. It might still get recognition from a couple of states. But however, to bring it back to the international law and so on, the non-recognition of a particular regime is not necessarily a determination that the community represented by the regime does not qualify for statehood. So non-recognition of a government may mean that it's not regarded as a government in terms of independence and effectiveness, or that the non-recognizing state is unwilling to have normal intergovernmental relations with it. It's important to note that the Taliban obviously will not establish a new state, though the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan will be known as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as Bakr also mentioned, right? It will not change its legal entity. So in recent times, there's been an inevitable variation in the recognition practice. So when we recognize certain states, for example, most recently, I suppose, in Venezuela, few countries have not recognized ex-president Nicolas Maduro and recognized the opposition leader Juan Guaido as a stopgap president of Venezuela. So we also see this in the case of Syria and Libya. Recognition practices gives then reasons to anticipate perhaps a revival of legitimacy characteristics of the policy of non-recognition. And therefore, the possibility of government recognition in Afghanistan requires a relook from a legal angle. Thus, the question is, will the recognition practice of governments get legitimacy as the Taliban militia captured power by the use of force? So the impact of non-recognition of a government is then different from the non-recognition of a state. The recognition of a government is legally not indispensable for diplomatic relations. It is broadly customary that revolutionary regime change does not make a case under Article 43 of the UN Convention on Diplomatic Relations. It doesn't stop the diplomats from discharging their diplomatic duties. Thus, the diplomatic missions to Afghanistan can, of course, continue to perform their diplomatic obligations under international law, even without recognizing the Taliban government, which we see in the cases of China and Russia, who are maintaining their embassies in Kabul, while many of the Western countries and Western powers have obviously left. As I don't know if you saw in the news the other day, they were raiding Norway's embassy, looking very perplexed at the pair of cross-country skis, amazing photos from the Norwegian embassy. But due to the volatile political circumstances that we are facing, they're bound to ask for additional guarantees from the new regime for their own safety and well-being. And it is equally important to underscore that international transactions among the nation states, in this case Afghanistan, require ambassadors and high commissioners to actually carry out their functions. And therefore, who has the mandate for the appointments? So consequently, here I find a non-conformist legal necessity for recognition and legitimacy, sensitivities, in the diplomatic pragmatism that we're facing. So, of course, I'm representing here the Diplomatic Academy, so I need to look at things diplomatically. And diplomatic pragmatism must weigh between de facto recognition and de jure recognition of the government in Afghanistan. Diplomatic pragmatism goes with the de facto recognition of the present then geostrategic scenario in Afghanistan and for the international community. And I suppose with that diplomatic rambling, I shall stop. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to come back to any of these themes and answer questions later. Thank you.